Yeah. Look at 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Verses 1, 2, 4. What's Paul say there? 2 Corinthians 12, 1 to 4.
Boasting, although there is nothing to be gained, I will go on to visions and revelations from the Lord. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether it was in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that this man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I do not know, but God knows, is caught up. Paradise and her.
And he goes on from there.
Yeah.
So Paul says, I saw the stuff of heaven. But what's the proviso he puts there? I don't know whether I was in the body or outside of the body. And that goes to that thing of, no one can see God and live. It's that fleshly experience is incompatible with the fullness of the wonder of who God is.
I think it would have been out of the body.
And again, Paul says, I don't know. And if Paul doesn't know, I'm going to say, I don't know. But it's certainly, he's hinting that we're talking about something that goes beyond what humans can experience. It is simply too overwhelming.
How do we know that's Paul? Like, that was Paul that experienced that?
First person.
Yeah.
He says.
Yeah. He's talking in the third person, but he's telling things that you simply couldn't say about another person with authority.
Then he follows it in verse 7 by saying to keep me from coming conceited.
Yeah.
This is kind of like, I'm not really bragging about this stuff that I've just done.
Right.
And who else could it be?
Right.
Yeah.
Why is he talking to himself? I mean, why is he talking about himself in the third person?
To try to distance himself from it.
Yeah.
It's an attempt to not say me.
Well, yeah,
John,
because he starts all that in verse 5, that I won't boast about a man
Yeah.
like that, and I won't boast about myself. Because even if I
That-
choose to boast,
See,
Right.
John,
A little snippet of that idea of experiencing the glory is when John sees Jesus in Revelation, how he falls down. I mean, the man who had his head on Jesus's shoulder and intimately talked to him and everything else. And here comes Jesus. And what does John do? Fall as a dead man in fear,
and
just
yet
to see the glory of Jesus.
he doesn't die. But again, it seems like God can. I'm going to use a weird way of describing, but kind of rheostat his glory. And he can set it right to the limit of what a person can take, or he can push it over that limit and you're dead, or he can turn it down so that you can carry on a conversation like he did with Abraham in his tent.
Well, considering he created us.
So, but again, that has nothing to do with us. That is entirely God choosing how much of himself to show.
Pastor, I'd like to make a quick statement, and I have 4 questions, but I'd like you to just do them in rapid fire. Like
Okay,
30
we'll
seconds
try.
on each one. I don't want to go into too much of the content of the Bible study. First thing, I read last night for the first time in my life, I read the sermon of Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God.
Mm-hmm.
Never read that. You should read it. And if you're not somebody who witnesses on a regular basis to people because you're afraid or whatever, I think this could be a good swift kick in the pants to you. Because it's a scary, I mean, when you hear it, there were people I read that people in the audience were just afraid when they heard it. And they had a guy, you can go on on YouTube, and they have many renditions of it where you can listen to it. But this guy was actually a pastor. He had the white wig he put on, and he did it. And it was, I thought it was really excellent. But I read it first, then I watched it. It was about 41 minutes to watch it, but it was really good. And if you want to get scared a little bit, you know, if I was just sitting in that audience hearing that and unsaved, it was something. I mean, it was just the way he did it. It was really good.
Just a comment, a couple of comments on that. Number one, Jonathan Edwards didn't think that that sermon was in any way exceptional or special. And in fact, he, to the best of my knowledge, never references it as something that was a unique experience or something that he even found to be something worth mentioning. So when people talk about that sermon and people know it was the norm of all of Jonathan Edwards' sermons at that time period that they got that result. So that sermon is the one that happens to be kept and was jotted down, although it probably wasn't word for word, it wasn't recorded or anything, but someone sat down and was taking notes and compiled those notes into but all of Jonathan Edwards' sermons during that period of time in his life were receiving that kind of response.
He did it in a monotone.
Yes, and he read it without looking up, and it was not dramatically acted out. He would simply walk up to the lectern, looking down and begin to read.
They said that when he did it in front of all those people, that he wasn't supposed to. The speaker didn't show up. So they asked him, "Hey, can you fill in?" So he did it. He read it one time before at his own church and gave the message, but he barely knew it. Like you said, he had to read it.
Yep.
That's what he did. So
Well, but that was his habit for speaking. He was not an extemporaneous speaker by any means. He wrote out his sermons and read them word for word. Now, I can't do that at all. That's something, when I was a pastoral intern during seminary at Pottstown Baptist, the pastor there tried to get me to write out sermons and read them. And I was the worst preacher you've probably ever heard. And then finally, as I was coming toward graduation after, preaching 4 or 5 times, every time it was just painful. If it was painful for me, I'm guaranteeing you it was painful for everyone else. And finally, he was out of town and he said, "Well, I guess I'll let you fill in for me while I'm out of town." And I preached and he came back and said, "Oh, you did such a marvelous job. I guess I'm finally getting through to you." And I said, "No, I finally preached my way. I ignored everything you've told me and did it my way."
that was an exceptionally when you read that. I mean, it felt like you were in the hell yourself.
Yeah.
It was really. Here's the questions I had for you.
Yeah.
You know when Jesus dies on the cross, at the time he dies, they said that the graves opened up and
Correct.
people came out of them. Obviously, that wasn't the regular. That was kind of more along the line of the resurrection that Lazarus, I guess, had, or right?
It doesn't seem that way.
But those people didn't stay resurrected, did they?
It seems that way because it says that when he ascended, they ascended with him.
But wouldn't Jesus, Jesus just died, so he would have gone to hell or, into like for 3 days or whatever. But he didn't go up to heaven at that time, right? Heaven wasn't open.
Not immediately. Well, he did. Okay. Let's. This is going to be a little more than your. Let's try to piece together, and I understand that we're trying to piece together here. What is the chronology of what happens with the death and resurrection of Christ.
Well, when-
So let's start with coming up towards his death. Let's start with that. So what is the chronology of what happens in his death?
So while he's on the cross, you mean?
Yeah,
Well, he has those sayings that he says several things.
they begin the crucifixion at about 9 a.m. after an all-night trial, and then a series of trials, back and forth. And he's on the cross.
He's on the cross at what time?
Isn't it 9 a.m.?
Is it 9?
And then about halfway through the crucifixion, what happens?
He's on the cross, you're saying when he's up
Yeah.
there. He goes through a series of.
We have the event of
Oh, he's talking to the two.
the darkness.
Oh,
And the
okay.
corpse and the graves open.
Yeah,
Doesn't that happen after he bows his head? and
Yeah.
All that stuff.
and there's about 3 hours of darkness. That's the final 3 hours of the crucifixion. And that brings us, that's what starts about noon. And that goes to about 3 in the afternoon. And at 3 in the afternoon, he dies. How do we know he was dead?
Bowed his head, gave up the ghost, so, right, that it is finished.
Here into
They shoved the spear into him and what? Okay, now, what actually happened that quote unquote blood and water came out?
Pericardium. Water comes from the pericardium, right?
Probably not.
When the cells start breaking down.
What happens when you die?
Decomposition.
Well, eventually, but almost immediately,
Heart stops.
Coagulation,
the blood begins to separate.
blood and water.
And that's why if a person dies, they fall on the ground and they're not found for hours. What happens when they find them?
Their skin, they're not red anymore.
They know where even if somebody moves them someplace else, they know that that wasn't the original place where they fell unless they reposition them exactly the way they fell, because the heavier parts of blood, and what's the heaviest part of blood? The iron. And that's what makes your blood red, is the iron. It comes out of the blood and it pools at the lowest point in your body once you die. So when they stab him with the spear and blood, what do they mean by the blood? The heavy stuff that has the iron in it that's red. And what do they mean by water?
Plasma.
The plasma, the clear stuff that is the blood without the iron, the red corpuscles in it, come out. Well, the only way that you can have the plasma separate from the red corpuscles is when you are dead. So at that point, Jesus is dead. Then what happens? Well,
Paradise.
according to Ephesians 4, and I know this is controversial, there's people who say, no, that's not what that means. But it seems to be what?
I would say he went to hell,
And why did he go to hell?
because there's 2 compartments there.
Preach.
To preach. It is not to pay for sin.
No.
I've heard people say, well, he went to hell to pay for sin. No, that's not true. Why?
The eternity was on the cross.
Because on the cross, he said what?
It is finished.
It's almost finished. I still have to go to hell yet and pay a little more, but it'll be finished in a little while. Is that what he said?
No.
It is done.
He said, it is finished. A single Greek word, tetelestai. What does the word tetelestai mean? Yeah, it means the final payment has been made. It is the word that was written across a mortgage or a loan when the last payment was made. And you would get that bill, that receipt that you owed this money, and that word tetelestai written across it was the proof, no, you have paid that in full. So he goes to hell to preach to those who are captive there. And then what happens?
When you say he goes to hell, he goes to paradise, in other words, right?
Right.
That compartment, and
Maybe both. Who knows? He could go and preach to those who are lost as well and say, hey, you know, the sacrifice was made. You just didn't avail yourself of it. But certainly to those who were the redeemed there. Now,
Was it in Ephesians?
Ephesians 4, yes.
Okay.
Now, what then happens on resurrection morning?
physical resurrection. Body. His body doesn't decay, but it's in his.
His body is raised from the dead. Then what happens?
Mary sees him and she's told not to touch him because he has a descendant.
Yes. And this is where in John's gospel, Mary is hanging out in the garden after the rest of the women run back to tell the disciples. I don't believe Jesus was resurrected when the angels pushed the stone or rolled the stone or threw the stone away. They didn't roll the stone away to let Jesus out.
He's already out.
They rolled the stone away to let them in. And if you ever go to Israel, to the Garden Tomb, the Garden Tomb is unique of all the ancient tombs ever found in Israel, because it says that Peter came up to the door and he looked in and he saw the headscarf where Jesus was laid. Now, I have something that writes. Most tombs in Israel got your stone track here. Most tombs are like this. You've got your stone area where that stone would roll. And when I was a young Christian, I thought of it as, just like a boulder there. It was not a boulder. It was a wheel. And that wheel was in a trough. And the trough was like this. And there was a little thing up here where the wheel would catch. You would roll it down into here. There's a lip about 4, 5, 6 inches tall in the front. And that wheel was a foot and a half thick. Would roll down in there, and you'd have to take pry bars and roll it back up that channel to get that door open. So here's the wheel. You open it up, and here is what was called the preparation chamber. And that's where the body would be prepared. And here you would have the buyer. You know what a buyer is?
Yes.
It's the place where you lay a body. Or a bier, depending on how you pronounce it and what part of. And there'd be a wall here. A wall here. So if you look in, you can't see the body laying on the bier. There's a wall there. So Peter could not have looked in and seen the headscarf where Jesus was being laid. And there are people that said, see, the Bible isn't true. He couldn't kneel down at this door right here and look in and see the body. Everybody with me?
Right.
But, all right. They found the garden tomb. Wow. Is this the right stuff? Yeah. Not coming off. They found the garden tomb. We're gonna have to spray that down.
There's spray over there.
There's spray right there.
Yeah, the blue.
Up.
On paper towel.
Yeah. that's what-
Oh.
Okay. Ah,
My word.
all right. They found the garden tomb. British nationalist was looking for a site outside of Jerusalem, and he finds this tomb. Let's see if another one leads right there. This tomb is unique. They've only found one of them in Israel. Here's your preparation chamber. Here's the track of your stone. This is unique though. Instead of going back in, it goes this way. Here's the wall. Here's the wall. Here's the place where the body is laid. Person kneeling down can look right in there, just like that, and see between the wall. Now here's the unique thing. They didn't hew stone for no reason. They didn't have jackhammers. They didn't have, stuff like that to do it. How did they do it?
Chisel.
Hand chisels. So the length from this wall, separating the preparation chamber from the actual burial chamber, how long would it be from this wall to that wall?
6 or 7 feet, 6 or 7 feet.
The exact length of the person who was getting buried. So
Just
they take me,
was it
and they measure 5'9" thereabouts. If this was my tomb, and this would be 5'9". This one, somebody in the garden tomb took the end of the bed, the buyer, took a hand chisel, and in great haste, a very rough job, it wasn't finished like the rest, carved out about 5 inches, 4 inches extra space. So literally they buried someone there that it wasn't intended for, and they did so in great haste.
That might have been the one and that he could see because of it.
And there you go. You could look in and see, here's the head scarf. And here's the body scarf, laying separate, simply collapsed, not unwound, not strewn everywhere like it would be if you took the body out, just as though the body disappeared out of it, collapsed.
Haven't you also said that when you were there, there's a window behind?
Well,
So that
in everyone, yeah, in everyone, it's not a window, there's an opening, in all of them, and what's that opening for?
it's-
Yeah, to let the gases out, otherwise, when you roll the stone away, you could poison yourself and die because of the, you know, the gases that are released as a body decays. So there would be, both through the door and through that vent, there would be enough light that would be able to come in, that you would be able to see inside of it. So Jesus is in there. The angels come and roll the stone away. He's undoubtedly already gone, but then Mary hangs around. The others go back, Mary hangs around. And Jesus comes to her, and again, we have this thing, does Mary collapse on the ground and go, oh, and when Jesus reveals himself to her?
No, she thought he was a gardener at first, right?
Yeah, she thinks he's a gardener. So again, that just confirms this idea that God can reestat his glory. He doesn't have to appear in the fullness of all that he is. He can wrap himself in a different form and be very able to carry on a conversation with someone.
Whereas the transfiguration would be the total. opposite.
Yeah, exactly.
Mhm.
And he says to Mary, what?
Why are you flying?
Don't touch me, because I am not yet ascended to my Father. Then Jesus is gone. And the disciples get together and they're talking about it and they go, oh, we don't believe it. And then
Gotcha.
he appears to the disciples and they go, wow, it's all true. And then Thomas comes back and he goes, I don't believe it. And Jesus appears again, the third time. And what does he say?
Brush your hand on my side.
Shove your hand in here. Touch my wrists or hands, whatever.
It's okay to touch.
Why was it okay for them to touch him late in the day, but it was not okay for Mary to touch him early in the day?
Because he hadn't ascended.
In the sacrifice.
Well, the ascension wasn't for 50 days more.
Well, then that means he went up to heaven to put the blood on the mercy seat and then he came back.
He was not the sacrifice on Easter morning.
Right, but didn't he have to ascend to go to heaven to put the sacrifice?
Yeah.
Correct. But it's not the ascension of 50 days later in Acts 1, while they're standing around and he ascended into heaven and the angels say, it is an earlier ascension, and that ascension is for what purpose?
The blood
Chelsea Day.
sacrifice.
He is at that point the high priest. He is in his high priestly role. And once the high priest had accepted the blood to be sacrificed, what happened?
Couldn't be touched.
He is ceremonially pure. He cannot be touched because touching him could bring about
Unclean.
being unclean. So he says to Mary, don't touch me. I've put on my priestly garments. I'm not the sacrifice anymore. I'm now the high priest. I'm on my way to the holy place. Later in the day, when he meets with the disciples and he says, go ahead. He's taken off his high priestly garments. He's no longer the high priest. The sacrifice has been fulfilled.
I don't get, like, I think what Chelsea said made sense to me about the blood, but did he do something with that blood in the meantime? Is that?
Yeah, that, however, in whatever fashion, yes, what did the high priest have to do on the Day of Atonement?
Sprinkle the blood?
He had to sprinkle that blood on the Ark of the Covenant in the
Holy
temple,
Yeah.
in the Holy of Holies in the temple, more specifically.
You're saying he took his blood?
Yep,
Went to the temple?
yep. Which temple though?
Heaven.
The one in heaven.
The one in heaven. Because remember when God told Moses to build the temple, starting with the tabernacle, what did he say?
Mirroring the one in.
Yes, you have to do it exactly this way because this is a copy of the real temple. And what you're doing down here is merely symbolizing what will really be done there.
So prior to that, he was killed, the blood was shed, but it wasn't taken by the priest.
Correct.
And put it, oh.
So the cross becomes what?
Well, the method, like when they go to sacrifice, I mean,
So what was the cross? The cross was the altar of sacrifice. Where was the altar of sacrifice? We've got to go back up there again to Lancaster, to the tabernacle. Where was the altar of sacrifice?
It was outside the temple, wasn't it?
It was outside the temple. It was in the temple courtyard. And the sacrifice was not made in the temple. It was made in the temple courts, but outside the temple structure itself. And the priest then, the high priest, took the blood in through the holy place, into the temple to the holy place, through the holy place to the Holy of Holies, and that's where the blood was applied to the altar.
So none of his blood, in essence, stayed on the ground or wherever it went, right? It was.
Again, I don't know how physically this was done. I'm not going to get into this Catholic thing where they go, this is actually becomes the body of Christ, but no. But in some sense, I don't know what that sense was.
Wouldn't it have to be all of it anyway?
No, it was not all the blood. Right.
Yeah, it was never all of it with the animals. 'Cause
So-
Cut it, that some of it.
Yes.
I don't know how that was, but in some very real sense,
I would say that it probably was all taken up somehow, because.
but that, again,
Yes.
we can conjecture, but I'm saying in some sense, whatever that was in God's, and someday we'll know, he brought that blood in to that heavenly temple and applied that. So when he comes back and meets with the disciples, he's been to heaven and come back. So the ascension 50 days later, or 40 days later, I mean, in Acts chapter 1, is actually his second ascension. Because he's had that first ascension in his role as high priest. That makes sense?
Yeah, a lot of sense. I never thought of it. I just didn't think that blood could be corrupted, so that's why I thought it would.
Yeah,
You know what I mean?
I don't know. And again, God has a plan, and I don't know exactly how. He doesn't give us enough firm, this is how it happened for us to, but it had to happen because that blood had to be applied to the altar.
I got a
All right.
question.
You had 4, that
Yeah,
was
I'm
1.
almost done. Herod and Pilate, was their association, was Herod like over, like kind of like governor, mayor?
No,
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 it was equal.
He was a
yes.
king, right?
Herod was a king.
remember, this is not Herod the Great who was the king when Jesus was born.
Right,
Herod the Great
the builder.
was the king of all Judea, of all Israel. Upon his death, there was a lot of infighting between his sons over the rulership. So his kingdom was divided into 4 tetrarchies. Why tetrarchy? Tetra is 4. Herod, his son,
Antipas.
right, received one of those tetrarchies. What was his tetrarchy?
This one?
No,
Judea?
it was Galilee. So
Oh,
he is
that makes
king
sense.
up in Galilee. Pilate, they don't, Jerusalem is such a hotbed of problems that the Romans say, we can't trust these people to oversee that. We'll send a Roman governor to oversee that tetrarchy.
The city or or Judea?
The Judea.
Okay,
There's 2 more tetrarchies that don't really come into play that were also overseen by children of Herod.
which we don't matter, but they're kind of equals is what it. Okay.
So they are equals, but technically, Jesus is arrested in, he's arrested in
Pilots.
Jerusalem. So who is in charge?
Pilot.
Pilate. But he is a citizen or a subject of
Herod.
Herod because he's from Galilee. He's the Galilean. So he comes to Pilate, and Pilate starts to have a trial, and somebody says, hey, he's Jesus, he's from Galilee. And Pilate says, hey, I don't have to get involved in this at all. I can wash my hands of this whole mess, send him to Herod.
Because he was a Nazarene, right?
Isn't Herod in town for the Passover?
He's in town for the Passover, correct. So they send him across to Herod's palace in Jerusalem. And he gets to Herod, and Herod starts to talk to him and says, boy, this is a minefield. No matter what I do, I'm in trouble. If I let him go, I'm in trouble with the Romans. If I crucify him or have him punished, I'm already in trouble because what had he just done? He'd already killed who?
John
John
the
Baptist.
John the Baptist. And how did that go for him? Not very well. He is mud in the eyes of the people. If I turn around and kill Jesus too, there might be a revolt. And even if it's unsuccessful, Rome will blame me. They'll throw me out on my can, and they'll put a governor in my tetrarchy, just like they did this one. So he goes, oh, you know what? Yeah, he's from Galilee, but he was arrested down here. He's your problem. And he sends him back to Pilate. And so they're both playing politics here as equals, trying to shove off. It's not that they're fighting over who gets to deal with Jesus. They're fighting over who has to deal with Jesus.
We're in Pilate's jurisdiction,
Yeah,
but Jesus is from
Herod's
From
jurisdiction.
Nazareth of Galilee.
Yes. Yeah,
Here's my last one, and
Yeah.
I'll just make this short. I heard a statement the other day, and they were saying that they were talking about the difference between the Bible and other books, and they said 1/4 of the Bible is prophecy. And they either said 2/3 have already happened and 1/3 is left, or 1/3 has already happened and 2/3.
I would say it's probably closer to 2/3 have already happened and 1/3 is not.
That was my question. Thank you.
Yeah. And again, I'm not sure that isn't even low, because remember, prophecy generally has to have what?
And that current event that happens and then one that happens in the distance.
Even long-range prophecies, that prophet either has to have a lot of short-range ones to prove their credentials, or those prophecies have to have a dual fulfillment, one short, one long,
Gotcha.
to, again, otherwise anybody can show up and go like these idiots do today. In 100 years, the oceans will be higher than Mount Everest, unless you get rid of every car on the road today. And we say, how do you know that? We do. And then we say, okay, well, what's the weather going to be next week? And they go, and they get it wrong.
Yeah.
And we should be saying, if you can't predict next week's weather, the chances you're going to be right in 100 years are so minute that I'm going to call you the village idiot, put a dunce cap on you, and put you in the village square in stocks, and everybody can throw tomatoes at you. But instead, we take them seriously. Linda, sorry, you had a question.
Real quick about, didn't he take the keys to death and Hades when he was in hell?
Yeah, and again, that's a kind of complicated answer. It's not necessarily, what is it that Jesus takes that's caused that? He takes the keys. People say, but what is it that Jesus takes?
It takes Satan's authority, like he's in now, it's his.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. And
What did
how
you
is
say?
that, how's that
You
for?
said it's like symbolic.
There's a fourfold change of authority that happens. What is the fourfold change of authority that you have to go through to understand that?
Oh, that who was given authority in the first place was us.
No.
Oh.
Who has authority to begin?
Oh, God.
God. Why does God bless, why does God have authority to begin with?
He created everything.
Yes. God is the creator. As creator, he's the owner. He has full authority. Then what happens?
He gave authority to Adam.
He gave authority to Adam. Genesis 1. I give you authority over the earth and all the animals on it. Yada, 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 yada. Okay? Then what happens?
Here's to Satan.
We gave into sin in obedience to the serpent. What does the Bible say about that? Whoever you give yourself to obey unconditionally becomes your master. At that point, Satan became master of the human race. If I, as a landowner, am sold into slavery, what happens?
Your land belongs to
My land goes with me. So therefore, my master becomes also the master of my land. So therefore, the authority over the earth was passed from God to Adam to Satan. But then Satan broke the rules. What was the rule that Satan broke? And that's what C.S. Lewis points out so masterfully in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
He killed a sinless man.
He killed a sinless man. He could kill you or I, because the soul that sins, it shall die. But he wasn't allowed to kill Jesus because he hadn't sinned. Since he violated the covenant with the original owner, his authority is rescinded.
That's what happened?
Yeah. And that passes then back to
Jesus.
to Jesus, the second Adam, because he was the one that was violated against. And so therefore now you have a break, because up to that point, when God ruled the world, there was both authority and power. He had both the authority and power. When he gave the authority to Adam, Adam had both the authority and the power. When Adam gave the right to Satan, Satan had both the authority and the power.
Gave the right by sinning, right?
Yes, by becoming the slave to a new master. But when Satan is forced to give up his authority, what happens?
God took the authority, but Satan kept the power.
Satan doesn't relinquish the power. God removes the authority and gives it to Jesus. And that's why, what does Jesus say in Matthew 28, 19 and 20?
He's given-
All authority is given to me both in heaven and on earth. But guess what? Not all the power. Satan still has the power. He is still the prince of the power of the air. Do you see the difference? And he will continue to be that until when?
Jesus returns.
Got to be more specific. Got to be more specific.
One-
The return in glory. You got to separate that out because there's two returns, right?
And two returns, rapture is one.
Right.
Comes in a cloud.
Yeah,
So it doesn't happen in the Battle of Armageddon.
until that's when it happens. At the Battle of Armageddon, at the glorious return, Jesus takes back the power as well as the authority. And they're reunited. And that's what allows us to go into the 1,000-year reign. Because Jesus then has both the power and the authority.
That battle won't be a battle as we know it. It'll be
Yeah.
so one
Well,
sided.
yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, does that answer your question, Linda? Linda,
Yes, yes, yes.
okay.
And
God bless everybody. Good stuff for a Easter week discussion, huh?
that's what